Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy that many of you came back to this last panel we have here in the afternoon. I think it's perhaps because all cookies are eaten, I saw, and that's one reason that you came perhaps a bit faster. We got now the last panel on culture and development, coping with diversity and change. And I think what we learned from the last panel is that there's a strong demand on talking about culture. Particularly, I think Holm brought up the point that we have to talk much more about the social, about the political. Lisa was talking about that you have to talk much more about communication. Communication plays a huge role. And Bina, he was mentioning behavior, values. These are issues we have to discuss. This is why I feel that this panel on culture and development, we are perhaps right here in the last panel to discuss some of these issues which came up already in the first two panel discussions. If you talk about culture and development, you could also start to continue now another Rocky Horror Picture Show with talking about other monsters. But I don't want to go in this direction to see development and culture as a different monster. But I think it's worthwhile to discuss the nexus between two terms. And what becomes clear, of course, that if you talk about politics, if you talk about development, particularly about development projects, about programs, culture matters. As Samuel Huntington in his latest book wrote, Culture Matters. I think that this is a very important issue, and if you just follow the development industry's projects, programs, what becomes clear that technological solutions have to always take culture into consideration. One main question is, of course, what we mean by culture. And what I found quite fascinating, across all languages, in every language, we have a term for culture, but it's always used in different ways. There's always a huge fuzziness about the term culture. If you talk about theater or concept, we talk about culture. If you talk about civilization, we equate it with culture. We talk about body cultures. We talk about institutional culture. There's the culture of the World Bank. There's a culture of ZEF, the Center for Development Research. And all PhD candidates at ZEF, they have in the first year in their interdisciplinary course, they have also an intercultural weekend where they struggle with this term of culture and try to discuss or find their way of how to understand culture. So what we can see, culture is a very fuzzy term, and again, to take up the thread from the last panel, there's a huge uncertainty about the term culture, as well as we know regarding the term of development. I think there's another discussion we could have here at ZEF, how to define development. So if we talk about the nexus, the interrelationship between culture and development, we are risking of talking about issues where we hardly find our way in. And this is particularly true about if we talk about the carrying out research on the nexus of development and culture. And I think this we want to do in the next hour, and believe me or not, I will try to keep it within 60 minutes. So the issue is, of course, that an anthropologist will focus on culture in a different way as an economist or as an ecologist. And having this in mind, I feel that ZEF might be providing the right roof for including people, researchers from different disciplines to discuss this nexus of culture and development, what one can call the kind of boundary discussion, concept, academic concept which we are using here at ZEF, to bring these different perspectives in to discuss this nexus, of culture and of development. Before we start, I just would like to briefly introduce the panelists we got here. We have here to my left side Bina Agarwal. I'm sure that most of you know her. She's a member of our advisory board. She's an economist by training. She's a director and professor of economics at the Institute of Economic Growth at Delhi University. And in particular, always, I think, took this question of culture into consideration, particularly when you're focusing on the role of gender in development processes, particularly in rural areas. To my right side, you got Maritta Koch-Weser, and what most of you perhaps don't know, Maritta Koch-Weser studied at the University of Bonn, so she's from our university, and she studied here social science. So she, I think, is the right person here also to discuss on our panel. And you work for about roughly 20 years at the World Bank. And since the last 10 years, I think you somehow changed the sides and were much more involved on the level of civil society. You are the founder and president of Earth 3000. You already mentioned that you're also at the University of Sao Paulo, where you're leading the Institute for Advanced Studies.
Not leading the Institute, I run a program.
You run a program, okay. On the Amazonia Transformatia. And I think there were many other things you did in recent years. Also welcome here, we're very happy that you're here. We have, moreover, Farah Purwaningrum. She is from Indonesia, and you are more or less finalizing your PhD. So I think you will hand it in next month. So it's more or less, so we're very happy that you took the time to be with us here. Farah holds a Master of London School of Economics, and she works on knowledge governance and industrial clusters in Indonesia. And she will tell us in a minute more about how here culture comes in and how to cope with culture. Then we got the far left, we got Wolfram Laube. He's an anthropologist, the University of Cologne, and I think you also know the ZEF in more than 10 years. I think you run through all ZEF programs since a student, and he is leading the Ghanaian German Center for Development Studies in Agarwal, and he's also coordinating this here from Bonn. He's carrying out his own research in northeastern Ghana. And last but not least, we got Marc Müller. He's an agricultural engineer with a focus of agriculture economics. And I think ZEF can't be such a bad place because he returned to ZEF. Marc, he worked in the Uzbekistan project at ZEF. And then you spent the years 2006 to 2009 at the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Sevilla. And now you're back for the Vascal project in Western Africa here at ZEF. So we are also happy that you're here with us on the panel. The idea of this panel, you see in each panel we structure something a bit different. In this one we are doing this way, that we will have 3 short, very brief inputs from the ZEF side, and then the two board members will briefly comment on our inputs, and then we will open the floor. So I hope that we at least latest in about 25-30 minutes can open the discussion to the audience. Farah.
Thank you, Conrad. In the discussion of nexus of culture and development today, I will focus on the issue of Knowledge Hub. I intend to show how the current culture and Indonesian science system restrains the creation of Knowledge Hub. Knowledge hubs are local innovation systems that are nodes in networks of knowledge production and knowledge sharing. The concept of knowledge hubs itself, it hinges on several characteristics. First, connectedness, linkages, and also the values driving knowledge sharing itself. In Indonesia, however, the development strategy of implementing Knowledge Hub is very much driven from and by the international donors. This is exemplified by the creation of centers of excellence. First, in the 1980s, the government of Indonesia once stated that 4 of its state universities are centers of excellence. This policy was aimed to assist marginalized state and private universities to build up on their academic resources. It was funded by the World Bank, and it was implemented by the Ministry of Education. To no avail, these centers of excellence do not develop into a knowledge hub. But this policy is still somewhat retained. In 2012, the government of Indonesia and tried to implement the concept of center of excellence as marked in the blueprint or in the economic master plan. This center of excellence is attached with the industrial clusters and very much oriented for producing more economic growth. The design of the master plan, however, is made by the Boston Consulting Group, and it was funded by the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Thus, in Indonesian science system, the development strategy of implementing these knowledge hubs is very much and has been influenced by international donors. However, interestingly, what I found is that the existing cultural practices as enacted by the actors in the science system reveals the dominance of first, patronage, second of all, friendship tie, and third of all, shared poverty. Patronage, which is part of the Javanese culture in Asia, is exercised by the central government, and this actually enabled collaboration between different government levels. This enables, for example, the sharing of research budget between different government levels. The second of all, friendship tie, which is crucial for the process of planning and government in Indonesia, is also another cultural practices that is existing within the science system. This friendship tie is apparent that within the officials, those who can work and communicate directly with the upper echelons in the ministries are those who have experience working with them in the past, or those who have shared alma-mater ties. So this is apparent in the case of the planning process in the Ministry of Industry in Indonesia in 2010. And the third cultural practices that is existing in Indonesian science system is shared poverty. Shared poverty is the logic of how economic resources are divided into small, minuscule economic pies and scattered within the science system in Indonesia. This is reflected in the management of the research budgets in Indonesia. You can see, for example, at the institutional level, there are many avenues to apply research grants in Indonesia. So these are the logic of the science system, or the shared poverty. Thus, the dominance and the structuring of practices as cultural practices inhibit the creation of knowledge hub in Indonesia. As attachment, loyalty, as well as connection with Jakarta, the Hauptstadt or the city, the capital in Indonesia, are needed for the science system in Indonesia to operate, especially in terms of funding support and in terms of collaboration. Now, this brings again the question pertaining to the subject of matter of culture and development. First of all, whose interest drive the development planning strategy in Indonesia? Is it the international donors or the national government of Indonesia itself? And second of all, will changes be possible with the existing practices that are ingrained in Indonesia, patronage and shared poverty? And third of all, how can centralization itself be ameliorated, which would enable more involvement of the district and the city government in the development of knowledge hubs in Indonesia? Thus, I pose these 3 questions to the panel and also to the audience for further discussion. Thank you.
Farah, thank you very much. I think what became clear in your presentation that you want to study culture, that you just follow the practices. Yes. You just, because culture is such a big term, such a fuzzy term, that you are focusing on practices somehow to pin down the culture. Wolfram, how are you coping with culture in your research?
Maybe a little bit up front. I mean, some people may wonder that we're having this discussion rather on a lower level. If I remember the last 2 sessions, they were on global development policies and global environmental problems and uncertainties in the science about it, or they pose to our life in general. And of course, culture and development is a topic which is also hotly debated, and Professor von Braun already mentioned rightly. Also, like if we discuss new development goals, global development goals, different parties, not only from Europe, from the North, will have an influence, and culture will matter in this discussion as well. However, we decided that we will, in this panel, more deal with research-related questions where we encounter culture in the field, sort of, and I think that's it's quite interesting for us, and I think we also come with questions to the board as how to deal with culture in many of the research projects we're actually dealing with. I myself have been working in Ghana for quite some time, and as he mentioned, I'm coordinating together with people from the University of Ghana a PhD program there. But I'm also having a research program on rural transformation, education and social mobility, and I'm taking development as a question more or less the other way around. I'm not looking so much at policies, but I'm more interested in what is actually driving people to develop themselves, what ideas of getting on, achieving something in life, having success in life, do they actually have? And I'm interested in the cultural models which are driving that. Cultural models being culturally derived ideas. I'm not going to define culture here now. That are enacted in everyday life, that influence our practices, our emotions, our motivations to engage in certain activities or not. Now, I'm focusing on northern Ghana, and for those who are not familiar with the area, it's a rather remote, rather poor area of the country where many people are actually engaged in agriculture. Now, the question for me was what kind of cultural models of personal achievement do actually prevail in this environment? And I'm talking to students, I'm talking to school leaders, to teachers, but also to old people, to see how these models, which are not, they're not unified and they're changing over time. How have they been changing? And what you realize is that, of course, in the olden days, in an agricultural area, agricultural success, having the cattle, and name, a concept which was mentioned over and over again, so that kind of a social acknowledgement of your agricultural and social achievement was very important. However, if you talk to younger people, it's less name, it's not agricultural success, but actually many people, and not only the youth themselves, but also their parents, have changed their model of success, and they're now actually looking for education. They want to educate their kids, and they heavily invest in education. Which is actually, of course, in some of the talks today, education was already mentioned, and somewhat as a panacea, but what you actually see is that in the context people are actually educating the kids, you may say that there's also something like an educational track. So what you have is that at least public schools, where most pupils go to, are pretty bad. The quality of education is pretty low, and people actually spend years, up to 15 years, up to secondary level, and then they fail to continue and have bad results. What it also leads to is a devaluation of manual labor. So many people who actually go to school find it very difficult to go back into agriculture, also go back into mechanics or any kind of skill training, but actually rather leave the rural countryside to go to cities to look for menial jobs, rather than to kind of invest in apprenticeships or something like that. Now, how does it relate to development and development policies? I mean, the interesting thing is, if you look at development policies in Ghana, but also international development policies targeted to northern Ghana, they're looking very much to a commercialization of smallholder agriculture. So actually the idea is to keep people on the countryside, because the cities are already full, and people believe that smallholders should be kept on the countryside. However, through advancement of technology and market chains, people are supposed to make more money on the land they already have it. Now the idea is that this, of course, is a technology-driven development which would need a lot of skilled labor, actually, which is not really provided in the system. On the other hand, the current cultural model produces people who are actually not getting the goals they're aiming for. So they're investing in education, and I mean, I think 3 out of 4 people you talk to, at least, are actually aiming for government jobs. They want to be teachers, nurses, and policemen, and so on. But these jobs are not there, and they're not qualified to actually end up at this point of time. So we create also a big mass of people who are not satisfied with what they're achieving in their life, which then has implications if we look at countries around the Mediterranean Sea, for instance, where you also had a lot of people having high, at least formally high educational attainment, but without no job offers. So in general, I mean, to conclude, of course, looking at cultural models and which impact they have on development entails a lot of questions. Methodological, so what is actually the influence of cultural models on my behavior, but there's also personal rationalities, economic rationality which play a role, so how to weigh this. Of course, it would be then also interesting as an anthropologist, I like qualitative work, but it would be interesting to quantify those things. So how many people actually follow this path, this model, who have different models, and how does it affect different behaviors? But of course, there's also pragmatic questions. It's like how to negotiate cultural models of success with official development pathways. How to negotiate it, and can it be negotiated? Should it be negotiated? Of course, in certain sectors, if we talk about HIV/AIDS, cultural concepts of sexuality and sexual practices are negotiated. How about how to get on in life? So that's some of the questions I wanted to pose.
Wolfram, thank you very much. And I think what became already clear, Farah was much more focusing on practices in coming closer to culture, to catch up with culture. You're much more focusing on what you call cultural models, what includes also values, norms, worldviews, what is all this, what I think Douglas North once called this shared mental models. So this perception often is not taken into consideration. Particularly, I think, in economics, or at least from the perspective of cultural science, is always the idea, economists here have always the idea that there's just one pure rationality, the belief in the homo economicus. So the question is, of course, to you, Marc, to what extent the homo economicus is still alive, or to what extent you take cultural aspects into consideration, and particular in the framing of your own research.
Yeah, thanks, Conrad, for that introduction and that challenge. So just upfront a few words on my research. So I am very much interested in the Bascal project. I'm very much interested in the potential impacts of climate change, particularly seasonal weather patterns, on the small-scale farming sector in the Savannah region of West Africa. So that's my research interest, and I want to address these research questions basically by means of developing computable simulation models for the agricultural sector, so economic models. Now at first sight, that is not at all related, for instance, to the work of Wolfram. But it turns out there is a lot of overlap, which I had to learn over the last 2 years since I worked in this project. So when you think in terms of computable economic simulation models, usually one has to think about 3 components. One would be, so what are the farming practices? What is the technology people are actually using? How do they do the cropping, or how do they do the animal husbandry? The second part is, so what are the assets? What are the endowments? How many hectares of land do they have available? How many people do they have in the family that can actually engage in agricultural activities? What about their market access? And the third component usually is then, so what's the strategy? How do they, at the beginning of the growing season, determine what to grow? What's their behavior, let's say? Now, and it turns out that each one of these 3 components has cultural aspects to it. Farming practices may be shaped by traditions. My grandfather did it, I did it. As Wolfram already said, but culture, that's nothing that's written in stone. I mean, people change their behavior all the time when it comes now to the farming practices. Other new crops are introduced, for instance. If you see that. Then Well, assets, yeah, market access could be also shaped, yeah, by belonging to a certain group of people. Perhaps some people have better access. If then it's a cultural component, well, difficult to say, but I think that needs to be clarified at some point. Well, and then finally, so how do people develop their strategy? And that brings me to the homo economicus. Yeah, so okay. Well, let's start by saying, once a farmer has decided what to grow, yeah, over the next months, yeah, to the next rainy season, it is quite a defendable hypothesis, in my opinion, that he does that, but he tries to achieve this goal with the minimum effort. This is particularly true, I believe, for poor people which cannot afford actually to waste resources they have at their disposal. So from that perspective, yeah, there is the homo economicus. Yeah. The next question is, of course, how does he decide on what to produce? Now, here we may have very different strategies. Yeah? Cash crops are perhaps by definition grown to maximize a certain profit that may be gained from it. Other farming activities may be pursued to generate cash income needed to engage in dry season farming. So that would be another thing. A third aspect would be the safety first consideration in terms of food security. So we grow millet, we grow cassava or yam to achieve that, and there would be no market signal that would convince a farmer to grow at least not to grow at least a certain minimum amount of food. So and from that, and while addressing all these three components, I had to realize, well, that for instance with the work of Wolfram have a lot in common. What I would now like to pose as question to the other panel members is simply, I mentioned some of the, well, okay, let's, in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, yeah, so there are some known unknowns, let's say. And the uncertainty, that means what are the unknown unknowns in that context? That is what I wanted to ask.
Thank you. Marc, thank you very much. In particular, was to show how cultural aspects can be included in models. As you know, we have to come to both the comment of the both board members. Okay, the unknowns. Maritta.
Well, that's a bit too much unknown for me. I would say by the title you chose, Culture and Development, Coping with Diversity and Change, you have defined that we're not having a general culture discussion here, but we have a discussion about whatever the engaged, our speakers here and others understand by development. How do certain things happen, or how can they be made to happen? You know, how, if you think more children will survive if they don't drink dirty water, how in a cultural context you get this done. So development is really the part that we can understand as outsiders is about very specific targets. It's knowledge hubs, is our centers of excellence, really centers of excellence, or is there covert and not so overt structure that makes it into something else? I think all the three contributions just come to confirm what I would like to postulate to all of you, that the age we have already moved into, particularly in the last 10 years with the internet and the webs that govern our world, we really entered a social age. We have the financial resources on earth, very generally speaking, and within most nations, to do what one would like to see done. And we have the technology somewhere on earth to get done. There was a very good comment in the earlier panel on technology, on science, the transfer of technology. We've got the technology. And the real challenge is not to define culture, but is to see how people can get together to make whatever they understand as the most that you can make out of these resources. And obviously, we are quite so far inefficient at that. We could become much more efficient with all the tools we have at hand if we get the social right. And part of doing this in 3 minutes is just to say, avoid, you said it in the opening, avoid the fuzziness thing. Culture and sociology and anthropology, and I was a professor of anthropology, it can be just so damn descriptive and general that it's useless. Make it useless. Useful. Useful. Make it less useless. Make it useful. And how do you do that? Differentiate. I think whatever you deal with, and we had very nice examples here from Africa, from Indonesia, and so on. Differentiate, go deeper, do probing questions. If you say, for instance, there is a cultural concept X in this part of Africa, how fixed is this culture vis-a-vis change? There are places where it's very change resistant, and there are changes, that are possible. Try to differentiate, see what is really happening, because change, social systems are a bit more like biological systems. They're not like engineered systems. They move all the time. It's like a virus that adapts to the latest medicine. See what is really happening, and how strong are sanctions in any such system for change. How much of it is truly religious or pseudo-religious? You get stoned if you drive a car, or don't you, even if it's forbidden to drive a car. How much is a social habit that we used to have? I can still read in Indian newspapers arranged marriage advertisements, but it doesn't mean that this is the only way it happens in India, or that there are modern ways to do it. See whether there are some cultural rules that have their roots in Stone Age times. I once worked among the Nambiquara Indians in Mato Grosso in Brazil, and there were twins, just had been born before I came, and the normal thing among Nambiquaras, because they are migrant people, is that you have to kill one, because in the old days there was no way to feed or carry two. But 20 years ago already, there was a way to feed and carry two. So, what are the roots of some of these cultural patterns that we observe? So, first question is, how fixed is culture vis-a-vis change, and in which ways? Second question is, of course, the nice question, how rich is culture? Aren't we losing, we were talking about agriculture, aren't we losing a lot of traditional knowledge? It's not just linguistics, it's real knowledge about agriculture, about seeds, about rainforest, about fisheries, that future generations will have to relearn or never will find out again. Cooperative systems, traditional ones, not Dutch systems in Bolivia, but Bolivian systems in Bolivia. So second question is, how rich is traditional culture? A third one which I came across, and third and last in the work I was engaged in personally, is always the social radius, both in space and in time. Simple example, you will find many societies where the home is very clean, the family is very cohesive, but in concentric circles, as you go further, you find that the larger societal cohesion is greater in Japan than in some other parts of the world. So the social radius, also in time, there are even cultures that have more expressions for the future, to think about the future, than others. Adaptability. In Amazonia, you find some tribes that, by definition, are multilingual. They must marry somebody from another tribe that speaks another language. And there are other tribes which have completely sealed themselves off historically. and they don't communicate. So I think these are just three complexes of questions as examples as to how in each case, instead of being fuzzy or overall descriptive, it may be useful regarding a certain development product to do this kind of probing. Of course, there are much more professional ways to explain that. Lastly, of course, we can never forget that each and every one of us here in this room, we have our own cultural background. Educators tell us most of it we acquired in the first 5 years of our lives. And whatever we do, we will never be able to do it in a neutral way, away from the place where we come from. Thank you.
Maritta, thank you very much. And I think it comes also clear from your presentation. It's also important to talk about culture, to say something meaningful without an essentialization, right? I think this is always a question to keep this balance. What I forget to tell about you is, of course, that the last 10 years you dedicated to innovations, to the questions how in a society innovations can be propelled, can be sent around, can be become more important. I think this is very important. In particular, it's important to social. I think that's very important. Thank you very much. We come to the last panelist, to Bina, and I think you were writing all the time, so there are many things to say. To save enough time for discussion, please, we would be happy if we can do it in 5 minutes.
Sure. You don't really know what I was writing. Okay, I actually have about 5 points to make. Firstly, economists have actually treated culture rather shabbily. Because typically you either assume, let's say culture is about social norms, there are many ways to define it. Either you assume, you take it as given and unchangeable, or you might, everything that you can't explain in your regression exercise, you say it's a result of culture. So you compare countries and you say, well, Asia's doing well, and so that's Asian values. It was also mentioned earlier. But what I want to say is that actually anthropologists who have looked at cultural practices have been have had a major influence on economic theory. And in fact, in some of the cutting-edge work that has happened in economic theory in recent years. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is collective action theory, and the other is bargaining theory. In collective action theory, for instance, as you know, economists tended to assume that people would not cooperate, that since rational actors were self-interested, including your farmer, so you had literally several thousand, I think 2,000 and something papers in the 1990s on business dilemma, all of which tended to prove that, of course, people would not cooperate. However, people who actually studied examples of cooperation on the ground could come up with many, many examples where people did cooperate. And a study of them indicated that issues like trust and reciprocity and social norms were very important in enabling people to cooperate. And that, of course, provided the gist for the inductive theory building which Ellen Ostrom, one of the Nobel laureates, provided, which is you actually see people cooperate, and then you draw the principles on which you build the theory. And a lot of collective action theory and a lot of the empirical work that's been done in ZEF, of course, also reflects that. The second example is intra-household bargaining. Now, if you look at the work of Gary Becker, a Nobel laureate of a long time ago, then the assumption was that households really act like firms. You know, you have, or really like glued, as Amartya Sen said, it's glued together family. That you have an altruistic household head who represents the household's interests and what you do is you maximize an objective function subject to a budget. And everybody in the household has some degree of common interest. Now, anthropologists studying households, of course, saw that this was not the case. There was huge amounts of conflicts in the family. There was cooperation and conflict. And it led, and I'm being very brief here, it led to a huge shift in looking at intra-household from the unitary household model to bargaining and collective models of the household, which have been hugely empirically tested now to show that that is a much better representation of what happens within families than the sort of altruism within the family and self-interest in the market kind of model which neoclassical economics pushed. So I'm making this point because I think it's extremely important not to separate out either anthropology and economics or to separate out cultural aspects and recognize how much they've contributed to cutting edge issues of economic theory. All the experimental games literature, which looks at altruism, that people are altruistic and not just self-interested, is also moving in that direction. Secondly, I want to say that the culture, however we define it, let's take social norms, can be both enabling and disabling. Now, it can be enabling if you think of, for instance, how social norms, trust and reciprocity enable collective action to the common good. But it can be hugely disabling, and there are many examples. Farah, you gave examples. There are many other examples where it can be hugely disabling. Particularly disabling in relation to caste, gender issues, where you have entire populations being confined, mobility being confined, female seclusion practices, and so on, which are disabling. Now, the question then is, why is it important to promote cultural practices and what can we do about it, which are enabling? Now, it seems to me, in relation to many of the issues we've discussed in earlier today, enabling practices are very, very important. In the issue of climate change, for instance, we recognize that cooperation is absolutely central. It's central whether we look at international cooperation or we look at local cooperation. And the only way we can understand that is precisely the intermix of economic self-interest along with the glue of trust and reciprocity aspects. There can be other examples, smallholder agriculture. Now there is the direction in which we are moving. People are talking about producer companies. The smallholders are too small to bargain with the state or to deal with markets on their own. So is cooperation an answer? Are farmers coming together to invest, possibly even pooling land, but if not that, at least pooling some resources to jointly plant their crops, to collectively purchase inputs, and to market their products. Now those are all issues of collective action and cooperation in which enabling social norms can play a very important role. So this brings me to the third issue, which is, can cultural norms be changed? And if so, how can we change them in a direction where these cultural norms are enabling rather than disabling? And here, I think some of what you said, I'd just like to pose at least 4 elements on how norms can change. And we know that from empirical evidence. One is laws. Now constitutions, whether at the level of constitution or just local laws, project visions of how you want society to be, how you want norms to be. And typically constitutions are much, much more progressive, typically, whether it's the Indian constitution, or South African constitution, or many other constitutions, than of course society is. And so there is that one element. Secondly, of course, collective action. Now, one person standing up and saying, let's take a woman who says, well, I'm going to drive in Saudi Arabia. It's perhaps she's not able to do that alone, but if a group of women do, and there are many examples from, for instance, in Bangladesh, from BRAC, where collective action enabled them to challenge social norms. The third is, of course, technology, internet. There are many bad things about globalization, there are many enabling things, and one of the things is precisely that you cannot hold disabling social norms forever, that people learn that there are other ways of being and doing. And media, of course, the role of media, and people towards it. So finally, I'll use my final 1 minute to do what Joachim and Conrad also said, which is research questions which emerge from this. I think there are a whole range of research questions. What are the forms and contexts in which culture is enabling or disabling? Could be one research question. Secondly, what is the interface between culture and, say, cooperation? I particularly think of cooperation because there's so many aspects of our development which really require cooperation in a variety of ways. So the interlinks between that and enabling social norms is very important. The third is the role of factors which enable us to make culture different. And I've listed 4, but you don't of course have to accept that just because I've listed those. I think we need to then examine them on the ground. How have these elements, changes in law, social action, technology and media, made a difference to changing cultural norms and values? And it's eminently researchable. I mean, these are not things out there, and not just researchable empirically, but I think could form the basis for further theory building.
Yeah, thank you very much for making so explicit these 4 dimensions how cultural change can take place. To talk about enabling practices, and of course I'm very happy that you also talk about interdisciplinarity. I think because this is something we always at ZEF try to achieve. I would now, I've got about 20 minutes left, open the discussion, open the floor, and invite the audience for comments, for questions to the panelists. So the floor is yours. Who would like to be the icebreaker, the first question?
I have the privilege to work for 15 years now in West Africa, not far from northern Ghana.
You can just tell us who you are.
Yeah, it works, huh? Yeah. I'm Mr. Dreyer, running the Dreyer Foundation and doing my business as well. Those 15 years have taught me a lot, because one aim of our foundation is to change the life of many, many people. Currently, we are involved in some way or other, more direct or more indirect, in the life of about 50,000 people in the region of Yoba. Yeah. And of course, those questions which are labeled here are of utmost importance to achieve anything. Yeah? And what I do miss a little bit from all panelists is, I don't use the word lightly, the role of religion. I was forced to actually study with the means available to me about African religion. There are Christians there, and Muslim, and animists, but I found that is a rather not very important question. The important question is the old religion. Africa has one religion and one religion only. The others are just impacted facets of thinking. And thinking, the programming of their minds is done by their very old religion. They have a different, what the Germans call Weltanschauung. I do not know a proper English word for that. It's the perception of the world. Yeah? And their perception of the world is very different from ours, if I may say so in general. Yeah? And if you are not able to communicate on their level, at least trying to understand how they see things and how their collective lives in family, in tribe, or whatever is organized, in the end you will not achieve anything. And from my point of view, as trying to do something, changing things there constantly, and doing that in many ways, we have been successful in involving their own terms in describing what we are intending to do. You mentioned the lack of words sometimes for future. This is a major problem, yeah, to try to get them into the future of things unknown to them yet. Yeah? So we are trying to describe that with their language, in their terms. And believe it or not, in the African culture, future is a question of ghosts, of what they call the ancestors. And the perception very often you find concerning African religion, that is a matter of superstition. Oh, very wrong, very wrong. I think they have a very clear picture of the world, and sometimes I find for myself even a better one than myself, yeah, how they see things. And if you are able to touch them, let's say, on that level, which is a rather abstract level, but you have to do it then by talking about crops or household or whatever, yeah, then you can communicate. And when you can communicate, this is a simple, very old statement, then you have a chance to change things. And I would suggest that ZEF looks more into that, I call it the religious aspect, because all those descriptions of things, of behavior, do not really help you.
Thank you very much. Also, just to mention that you're also one board member, and just because you raised the point of communication, the former director of ZEF, he wrote a book on culture as communication. So, I think that this goes in the direction of Wolfram, with this idea, with this approach of cultural models. We use to cope with this question of maintenance of road use. But I just want to say,
okay, I can try to respond to it. I mean, I'm not calling into question the wealth of your experience in Africa, and it's sort of difficult for me to, but it's sort of difficult for me to fully respond. I believe that religion plays a major role, and I believe that this varies to degrees from person to person. I mean, I'm also working with a lot of people, and what you have been just trying to do is something I try to avoid in my work, to have already a conclusion about how people are. So for researchers, I think it's more important to try to understand how the diversity of how people are. So, I mean, what you have been doing is saying that they're all like that. That's, for an anthropologist, very difficult. I mean, for us, it's more interesting, first on a qualitative basis, to understand how people differ. And I feel that, I mean, from my research, there's vast differences within generations and between generations. And for me, it's interesting to understand how this change is happening, rather than to see static forms of culture. Nevertheless, there may be some, what we might call leitmotifs, certain aspects of culture which are stronger in certain cultural areas. We had this, I didn't like the debate very much about a German Leitkultur in Germany or something like that. Yeah? But I mean, these debates are there. You know? Yesterday night I watched TV, and there was kind of Qatar is majorly investing in Paris's banlieue, and there were discussions about what is this doing to our culture. So there is something which is maybe common to many people. On the other hand, I mean, I'm pretty sure if some of my colleagues from ISA, University of Ghana, would be sitting here, some are very strong reverence in Christian churches. I mean, and they really assign to that. If I work in northern Ghana, I find very stout believers in the Muslim faith. And I think they would kind of find it difficult to assign what you're saying. On the other hand, there may be some of this license.
thank you very much. I have many people on my list. I start Hassan, and then the two in the back. Anna.
Basically, half of what I said. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Basically, I want to subscribe to what Wolfram just said already. I have the impression that the diversity, not only in Africa, but also here within our culture, is being lost if we assume that there are some basic similarities, because we have this vast heterogeneity when it comes to values, when it comes to religious, even when it comes to deep conceptions about nature, about the relation between man and nature, not only between Europe and Africa, but also within Europe, within this room probably. So I find it very difficult, especially when it comes to when it comes to constructing homogeneous identities of us versus others. And I think we have to be very careful if we're using the term culture in this way. I find it far more productive to use culture, not as a static term, but as a constructive term. Culture is actually what people think and feel, what the norms and values and practices that they have. This actually prevents the term culture from being appropriated by those who define what are Asian values and what is Islamic culture, etc., etc. And we all know how dangerous this is.
Thank you very much. I think so becoming the point that Maritta was telling, that we can talk for hours and hours about culture and we'll not find an end about discussing about culture. So, next one.
Well, first, just to add to that, this last comment, I think previously in the past we used to enjoy this, what I may call a culture of religious tolerance. And this is now, in most part of the world, I think, is gone, and there is now a culture of extremism, religious extremism, and this is really very bad and dangerous, which is spreading, unfortunately spreading. We may call it culture or anything else, but it is spreading. But my question is for Farah. I very much enjoyed your comments about knowledge hubs and centers of excellence. But I think you're missing the third component, which in my view is very, very vital for these two. And that is the universities of excellence, or the world-class universities. Because without good universities, centers of excellence or knowledge hubs will not function properly, because you need this all the time, the introduction of a new generation of talented scientists and technologists to feed into the knowledge hubs and also into the centers of excellence. But the centers of excellence, what is so important about them, although you mentioned 4, and that's a question I wanted to ask you. Have you detected anything that these 4 centers of excellence managed to be spread around Indonesia in the form of a culture of scientific excellence? People are aware now about scientific excellence and how important it is, and have these centers of excellence, 4 of them, managed to do that? And what kind of disciplines do they work in?
And now you are hitting a weak point, because the University of Bonn tried, I think, for 4 or 5 times to become a University of Excellence and failed. So we can do in the background.
Thank you. My not question but discussion with Wolf about this investment on education. First of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Abdul Salam Lodi from Pakistan, and doing my research on issues of schooling and child labor in Pakistan, where I found that their perception about economic returns is playing a very important role in their decisions regarding sending their children for school or child labor or any other activity like religious education or something less. Because the market, like in some cases, when they have ability but not willingness to send their children, they are not sending their children because of the poor response from market for common people, like the people who are not able to, well known or something, like they are not able to compete with the other people, and they are not able to send their children for higher education to up to certain level. They can, because it's free. Basic education is free, but still they are not sending, because at that level of education they found that they will not, their children will not able to get some jobs, and in the areas where especially private markets are missing, this is becoming a more problem. So it's something to answer some of your, and the other, like gender issues are also coming, because the females, there is a job discrimination regarding gender, and are some security issues. They are not like females are not find jobs because of security and gender issues from market, and because of this signals of market, you can find that low female literacy rate in this such areas also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have 3 final comments, and then we just come back to the panelists and close the session.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Deribele. I'm an alumnus of ZEF, and it's refreshing to be back on a visit, short visit. My comment relates to culture and religion, and then I have a question. Certainly, the role of culture in development is receiving increased attention, and we all agree that this is very important. And the question is how we can actually get our universities, academic institutions to do a lot more in this area. And that takes me to the issue of religion. Back at the University for Development Studies, where I teach in Ghana, we've been working around this concept of endogenous development, where we believe that people's worldview structurally important in development. And I'll give you an example. In Ghana and in many cultures across the world, land, for instance, does not only belong to the living and those who are unborn, but it also belongs to the dead. So if we talk about sustainable land management, it challenges us to redefine sustainable development in this particular context. The point is that it certainly introduces a spiritual domain or element, which is very important for control. So where we've been having problems is because we have experienced some kind of change, some transition, without the accompanying institutions to deal with what? This kind of change that has happened. So that is just by way of a comment or contribution to the issue of religion. I hail from northern Ghana, and I like the analysis on a shift towards education. It is true that in general we have people have bought into the idea of education, and many more are sending their kids to school. But is this shaped by culture? Yes, to some extent. But the other reason why people who send their kids to school is because they have been farming for all their lifetime without enough economic rewards. And so in dealing with these issues, how as an anthropologist or a sociologist, how are you, this is now a question to the panel, how are you able to deal with this kind of distinction and how things are interconnected? And the other dimension is, which we're experiencing is that as households send their kids to school, there is labor shortage without the accompanying technologies to support agricultural production, which many households still depend on. What is the way forward in dealing with such kind of transitions where there hasn't been adequate preparations? That would be my question to the panel. Thank you very much.
Manuel, thank you very much. Now we got two questions. The final one here in the first row. Joachim?
Okay. Can I use the mic? Thank you. My panel. Two quick points or questions. The theme is coping with diversity and change. Bina, could you comment on coping with uniformity? The rich and the middle class have more and more similar values around the world. Global culture, some people call it. Is that good for collective action, or do you see risks? Secondly, maybe some of the panelists could discuss a bit more about culture and aspirations. Isn't opening up to worldwide information a tremendously powerful force to lift aspiration levels, which can be problematic if frustrated and can lead into aggression? Could you comment on that issue? In principle, I think it's a good thing to have high aspirations.
Thank you very much. That's interesting.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jörg Schasinski from the United Nations University here in Bonn. Thanks to some of the panelists, we heard a lot of things about knowledge hubs, knowledge dissemination, social systems, collective action, and you also briefly touched on the topic of media. So bringing this together, there is a phase meanwhile which is called social media, and I would like to ask you, what is your estimation on the potential of social media in terms of the context of research on development and things like that? Because, for example, from disaster management, we know that information dissemination within social media is sometimes simply much faster than in conventional systems. And a keyword is, for example, crowdsourcing and so on. So I would be interested in your perspective on this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also a former ZEF member. Jochen from Bonn told me that they have to close at 6 o'clock. So this is the reason why I think that I would now close the discussion here and just give every panelist 1 minute to reject, to you can also think about what you want to reject, but you have to react. So on which issues you want to reject, which you want to react on, and then just think we do it vice versa, the Bina starts, and then we on so Bina, your turn. I think there are many questions others to you.
Well, I'll be very quick. First, I think religion and culture need to be disentangled historically. In my own research looking at South Asia, I found that cultural norms overlay religious differences. If you take women's property rights, for instance, and take Sri Lanka, you have the Sinhalese population, 80%, you have Buddhist, you have Muslims in the eastern province, you have Jaffna Tamils. All of them were uniform in giving women very strong property rights. And the same religious groups in northern India gave very little. So I think the uniformity is coming in, but I think it's politically driven and not necessarily culturally rooted as it was earlier. So this is something we need to think about. I just want to say a question. We talk about education. What kind of education is very, very important? You have highly educated people who are extremely parochial, leading violent mobs against minorities and so on. So I think the content of education is very, very important. What values are we creating through our education? Joachim, your question. Uniformity, yes, some degree of uniformity is coming in. It can be for the good. It may not be for the good. It could lead to collective action for the good. But you also see people coming together for, as I said, you can have negative, dark side of social capital. New forms of social capital can be built. But if properly used, yes, it could move forward. I think it could be very positive for the environment if some of these are brought together. So, for instance, young people in India are very affected by what happens in the United States. If it was cool not to have a car, to go by bicycle in the United States, and they saw American kids doing it, I think people would say, well, yes, that's how we want to be. Take a T-shirt. It doesn't matter in India. You won't be able to recognize whether it's a domestic help or it's the rich man's son. Everybody is wearing T-shirts. So there is a degree of uniformity. I think it's very positive in terms of everybody looking alike. But it very much matters how you harness that potential. Social media, I have no answer to the issue of social media, what effect it could have on development, something to study. I think all media has impact. Media has a very important role to play in acting as a corrective and in being the conscience and the critical voice. And where it exists, it has made a huge difference. I know in my part of the world, media in general has played a very important role in exposing corruption, in bringing people to justice who would not have been brought to, justice wouldn't have prevailed if that hadn't happened. So on the whole, I see all forms of media as playing a very important positive role for development.
Thank you very much. Maritta, it's your turn.
All right. Well, I come out of this thinking that in terms of the ZEF agenda, you really have two rather different fields. One is the social, cultural, in everything that you study and do. For instance, in the previous session, you could have used the sociologist at the table on land and water. And so it will be with each and every topic that you tackle. And as you do this, because things change so fast, and there's bargaining even within the family. I like that stress you put, Bina. We just need to further develop tools to oblige people routinely to look, to differentiate, and not to judge. Because this is a shifting ground. It's not a reliable cultural pattern X, Y, or Z. So that's one. The other one is your question, well, there are new things out there. A lot of them work via the internet. For instance, I'm on the board of Better Place, betterplace.org, crowdsourcing. You have a good project, a small development project, maybe in your part of Ghana. You put it on the Better Place platform. You have to have, I think, at least 3 people of some respectability who vouch for it and say this is a good thing. I've been to these projects, you can believe it. And things get funded. More than 4,000 projects in the last 3 or 4 years. People just do it. They take it in their hands. There are social stock exchanges. In Asia, in South Africa, in Portugal now, one is being built in Ireland. There's impact investing. Nobody was talking about impact investing in 2003 when I started to look into this. It's become a regular thing. You get newsletters on the internet to do it. I mean, similar to Better Place, you have kiva.org. You can, in Brazil now, you can round up, in Israel, you can round up, in Germany since a few months, you can round up at 44,000 cash points, always to the next 10 cents. And there's sort of streams of mass-produced money, tiny money, totally painless, go into development processes. So there is a wave where people begin to take things into their own hands, where you don't have to be rich to make a difference. And coming back to that middle class, global middle class question, there's then this, next to this analytical field which we discussed, there's the field of opportunity. To look at those new networks, to look at those new platforms, and I bet as we look this year, next year there'll be additional ones. So this is a fantastic development opportunity and a cultural one. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. And somehow, you know, challenging the other 2 panels that we had before, which are very much focusing on the United Nations and so on. That's just saying there's an alternative. Just take social networks much more consideration. I mean, this is a question to what extent we should not much more think about social networks, social entrepreneurship, even also in our research. Marc.
Oh. Well, concerning certain of the topics that raised here, I have actually not much to say, because they will stay beyond my experience and my research. What I found very interesting was the initial statement by Mr. Dreyer. I think that I would like to continue some of your experiences concerning the change you have brought about and that you have observed, perhaps bilaterally. I think that your statement is something that, but also what, I mean, it's for me very much the same thing. Cultural aspects do matter when it comes also to changing agricultural technologies, how to introduce innovations, how to introduce new way of collective action, and that we have to build on the experience we have so far gained.
Thank you, Marc. Wolfram?
Okay, thank you for having the opportunity. Maybe the discussion on my research in Northern Ghana, we can also continue that, because I think those people who have been commenting on it are here at ZEF. I'm cooperating with them anyways. So let me also come back to this question of, uniformity versus diversity, which I find interesting. And I mean, of course, I had to respond to you because you were focusing on uniformity so much. On the other hand, of course, as an anthropologist, and that's why we also put culture in the focus here. We also believe that there is a certain degree of overlap. So that's something which I think this debate will, as Maritta said, will never end. Second question I found good and was Joachim von Baum's question towards aspirations and and how far kind of striving to better your life and how far getting better education and through better education being exposed to media, being exposed to information, being exposed to new opportunities. I completely agree that this is also something, it has positive points. I was just pointing, at one point at this potential education trap, which is also there, and what I find interesting is then the nexus to development policies. So that's kind of this policies focusing on agriculture at one point when it is more or less neglected and avoided by local farmers who were not really interested in green revolution at the time it was promoted in Northern Ghana, who then come back to the agricultural sector and want to educate their kids. Out of this negative, come back into the agricultural sector at the time of structural adjustment, when then there is no support for agriculture again, and kind of it becomes a non-profit activity, sort of, so they then shift to education, and now development policy is moving back into agriculture, and they have all educated their kids who, education wasn't a focus during structural adjustment time, although Ernest Ayeti just told me that still 55% of the Ghanaian budget go into education, so it's not that it's not anything happening, but the quality is low. So the question will be is kind of, how to get a better overlap between kind of fashions and development, and maybe kind of this formation of cultural models, which I believe are sometimes intergenerational or something like that, if that can be achieved.
Wolfram, thank you very much, and make sure that Marc and you will sit tonight to dinner together with Mr. Dreyer. And also make sure that you will sit together tonight with Mohamed Hassan, because he will also come back to his question.
Thank you. To respond to the question that you've asked, indeed universities are important, but I did really emphasize on the second part. In the blueprint itself, it is emphasized that the center of excellence universities are to be linked with industrial clusters. But on the other hand, on the one hand, we see in Indonesia, there are concentration of universities mostly located in Java Island. But on the other hand, these universities are not sufficiently linked with industries. There are a lack of knowledge exchange and knowledge flow between academia, universities, and also industries. You mentioned about scientific excellence. Because of the centralization of Indonesian science system on an overall basis, the scientific excellence is very much determined by Jakarta, by the Hauptstadt. You can see, for example, in terms of international journal, for application of every professorship in Indonesia, you have to have publication of international journal. And this is very much emphasized by the Ministry of Education. So, in a way, the centralization process is disabling the linkage between academia and industry, because that's what my research is all about. So I hope I answer your question. Thank you.
Farah, thank you very much. And I will now avoid to make your final statement, because I think it became very clear that culture is such a huge and difficult term. So I will avoid now to come up with a conclusion. I think it was important to show how, from the research perspective, how difficult it is to cope with culture. And I think all the 5 panelists gave an idea how we can cope with the impact of culture on development and vice versa. I would like to thank all 5 of you for joining this panel and giving some comments. I would also like to give everyone applause to the panelists. We will have the last word. The final conclusion was told to me. I hope I'm not wrong.
This was an extrapolation. No, thank you. You were a fabulous audience, made a major contribution to the deliberation of the future research agenda. We had 3 great panels. I think what stands out is that ZEF engages with its board and its community in a focused debate on how should development move forward. The idea is that the goals for the future need to be defined bottom up and not only top down, that they have to embrace culture, economy and nature, and that they have to be guided by respect among nations and among people, I think was pretty clear among all of us. So let me thank you again, and this is to be continued.
Wie war die Fahrradtour?
Die Fahrradtour war super.
Ja,
ja.
Willst du noch mal erzählen?
Ja, mache ich gerne. Ich wäre gerne weitergefahren. Aber nach ein paar Tagen habe ich mich auch wieder an Bonn gewöhnt. Ist auch nicht so schlecht.